They didn't just want them gone. They wanted every last shred of proof burned, the very memory erased from the soil. 40 years later, I still hear the helicopters, not the screaming. I was the one who accidentally paved the way for the deployment order, even though I knew the truth about the terminus. If I told you what I saw, what they are, you'd call me insane. But the real madness was letting the government define reality in those deep ancient woods. It always starts with a lie, doesn't it? A flimsy curtain dropped over the unthinkable. I was the one standing right behind that curtain when they began pulling it down. Before we begin, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I was Elias Vance back then, not the trembling old man you hear now, trying to piece together fragmented memories over a static connection. I was 35, built like granite after years of hauling timber and fighting wildfires in the relentless cradle of the Cascade Range. I wasn't a scientist or a conspiracy theorist. I was a glorified grunt. I was a wilderness patrol specialist for the U.S. Forest Service, assigned to Sector Gamma 9, a brutal, high-elevation slice of forgotten acreage that bordered state park land and a notorious, abandoned logging zone. It was my solitude, my penance, and the only place left on Earth where I felt like the world wasn't quite finished yet. The forest was my marriage now. The woman who'd once worn my ring had left 5 years prior, claiming she couldn't compete with the smell of pine pitch and stale coffee clinging to my uniform. She was right. I preferred the silence. I preferred the grinding routine of checking trap lines, mending fire breaks, and logging the endless bureaucratic forms that detailed everything from bearscat density to the specific gravity of the seasonal runoff. That routine was my sanctuary. It kept the ghosts at bay. The cold, clammy memory of a search and rescue mission that went sideways in '88. The one where I didn't reach young Jimmy in time. The guilt was a heavy lead weight I carried in my chest cavity, and the forest, with its constant demands and unforgiving nature, was the only thing strong enough to hold it steady. My life was a symphony of predictable sounds, the hiss of the pressurized cooking stove at 4 a.m., the rhythmic metallic squeak of the aging F-250's shocks on the rutted fire roads, the distant, steady rush of the North Fork River. And the smells. God, the smells. Damp moss, sun-baked cedar. The sweet, earthy aroma of decomposition that always reminded you that life here was transient, brutal, and cyclical. I lived out of the old ranger station, a crumbling clapboard shack built during the Depression miles from the nearest paved road. My radio was my only link to the civilized world, a crackling, unreliable thing that mostly only piped in weather warnings and the occasional update about a drunk hunter needing extraction. It was a perfect, isolated bubble of responsibility. I cherished the quiet predictability of Gamma 9. I knew every bend in the creeks, every erratic boulder left by the last glacier. I knew which ancient Sitka spruce trees were used as scratching posts by the biggest black bears, and I knew the exact moment in the fall when the light began to drain out of the sky too fast. That familiarity was safety. It was proof that the world was still ordered, still rational despite the chaos I carried inside me. But in late September of 1996, the order, the natural order of my world, shattered. It didn't shatter with a roar or a massive clawed hand ripping through the door. It shattered with an unnatural silence followed by the drone of machines that didn't belong. I was driving Sector 4, checking the boundary markers near the old mining claim, the place locals had vaguely called the Cascade Collapse for its sheer, unstable rock faces. The time was just past noon, and the light was that thick, golden hue that promises a long, lazy afternoon. I noticed it first in the wildlife. Usually deer would bolt, small rodents would chatter warnings, and the local magpies would heckle my truck endlessly. Today, nothing. The woods were dead. Not silent in the way they are before a snowstorm, which is an expectant, heavy kind of silence. This was an evacuated silence. The air felt thin, like the forest was holding its breath, a deep collective fear pulsing through the root systems. My old instincts, the ones honed by years of walking alone in places where predators vastly outnumbered men, screamed at me. It felt like walking into a room immediately after a violent argument, where the emotional residue is still thick enough to taste. I stopped the truck, killed the engine, and stepped out. The smell hit me next, overlaying the pine and dirt. It was acrid and chemical, like ozone mixed with industrial lubricant and a hint of burnt soil. I pulled my worn leather jacket tighter, despite the mild temperature. My knees felt strangely weak, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up in an involuntary electric rush. I reached for the shotgun I kept racked behind the seat, a habit born of prudence, not paranoia. Then I heard the low, mechanical grinding. It was coming from deeper inside the collapse area, a place strictly off-limits, even to me, due to instability and the environmental hazards left by the defunct mining operation. It was the sound of heavy equipment, not logging gear, but something heavier, more precise and utterly dissonant with the wilderness. I grabbed the radio handset, my hands slick with sweat. Sector Control, this is Vance. Gamma 9, I'm near the collapse. I'm picking up unauthorized machinery, heavy lift and possibly drilling. Do you have any traffic on this? The response was immediate, which was unusual and far too smooth. It wasn't the usual crackle of the dispatcher, Betty, complaining about the heat. It was a cold, synthesized voice devoid of inflection. Vance, stand down. Sector Gamma 9 has been temporarily reassigned. You are required to hold position and await new instructions. This is a sanctioned, limited environmental remediation operation. Code, Terminus. Terminus. The word felt cold and final, like a decree handed down from a stone pedestal. It wasn't a Forest Service code. It wasn't even standard government jargon. It sounded utterly corporate, utterly lethal. Remediation? I pressed, ignoring the instruction to stand down. My job was to patrol, and Terminus was invading my patrol area. Remediation of what? I received no prior notice. Who is operating this equipment? Negative information, Vance. Repeat. Hold position. Any attempt to enter the secured perimeter will be considered interference with a classified federal directive. The voice clicked off before I could respond. Classified federal directive. In the middle of my quiet little corner of hell. That's when the second wave of dread hit me. The feeling that this was far larger and more dangerous than a simple unauthorized dump truck. This was a violation. I held my position for maybe 10 minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs, watching the trees. But I couldn't be Elias Vance, the dutiful cog, anymore. The woods had taught me that when something doesn't look right, you don't wait for permission. You investigate. The quiet was too loud. The Terminus order was too demanding. I left the truck and started walking off trail toward the source of the noise, moving through the underbrush like a phantom. I was a ghost in my own territory. As I got closer, the sound sharpened. It wasn't just drilling, it was the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of massive earth movers and the occasional metallic shriek of cutting tools. The air thickened with that ozone smell. I finally reached a vantage point on a slight ridge, peering down into a small bowl-shaped clearing I knew well. The clearing was swarming. They weren't loggers. They weren't environmental cleanup crews. They were uniformed men, but their uniforms were sterile, dark gray, and bore no patches, just small reflective serial numbers on the collar. They moved with the efficient, terrifying silence of highly trained military personnel. They were setting up a complex, multi-layered perimeter. Massive portable floodlights were already running, casting a sickly yellow glow even in the afternoon sun. And in the very center of the clearing, they were drilling. Not for mineral samples, but with a massive, specialized rig that looked like something out of a deep-sea oil operation, chewing through solid rock and soil at an impossible speed. But what truly made the bile rise in my throat wasn't the equipment or the men. It was the shape of the perimeter. They had thrown up chain-link fences, razor wire, and then, inside that, they were positioning massive sound-dampening panels, all directed inward, enclosing a central dark hole they were carving into the earth. I pulled out my binoculars. One of the men, clearly a field supervisor due to the array of electronics strapped to his chest, was barking orders into a handheld device. I watched as 3 other personnel, wearing what looked like hazmat suits reinforced with Kevlar, emerged from one of the temporary modular trailers they had somehow erected. They weren't carrying drills or surveying equipment. They were carrying rifles, heavy-caliber, military-grade weapons that had no business near an environmental cleanup. I dropped the binoculars, clutching the stock of my shotgun. My routine had been violated, my sanctuary invaded, and now it was clear. This was an armed occupation. Project Terminus wasn't about cleaning up an old mine site. It was about securing, containing, and possibly eliminating something. My mind raced back over the last few years. The missing hikers that were never found, dismissed as bad weather. The strange, massive tracks the old-timers swore belonged to a bear that walked on two legs. The absolute certainty of the indigenous people that this specific valley was sacred, cursed, and fundamentally off-limits to man. I had always dismissed those things as folklore, the necessary mythology of the deep woods. Now, looking at the paramilitary unit drilling directly into the earth with military precision and lethal intent, I suddenly understood that the forest wasn't just holding its breath because I had arrived. It was holding its breath because they had arrived. And whatever they were drilling for, whatever they called the last Cascade colony, Project Terminus was coming to end it, and I was standing right in the way. It's been 40 years, and the silence of those high-altitude canyons still claws at my sleep. The cold that night, it wasn't just physical. It was the cold of knowing you are utterly disposable, that the machinery of the world is preparing to grind something sacred into dust. If I told you how organized they were, not the feds, but the other side, you would call me a lunatic. You'd say I'd been up in the thin air too long drinking tainted creek water. But I saw the lines drawn in the earth, the silent preparations for a siege that the official history books will never acknowledge. The truth is, the reason the feds wanted the Cascade colony gone wasn't about land or timber. It was about erasure. It was about eliminating the oldest claim to sovereignty on this continent. Before we begin, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I was Elias Vance, back then. Not much to look at. Just a man hardened by mountain weather, wearing patched-up denim and smelling perpetually of pine resin and diesel. I wasn't military. I wasn't a spy. I was a goddamn patrol ranger for the U.S. Forest Service, Sector 12, covering the furthest, most unforgiving reaches of the Central Cascades. I was good at it, too. I could tell you the difference between a bear breaking a branch in a high wind shear just by the sound. And I knew the difference between a panicked hiker and a deliberate, methodical intruder. My 20s bled into my 30s in a cycle of isolation. It cost me my marriage, of course. My ex-wife, Sarah, used to say I loved the quiet more than I loved her voice. She wasn't wrong. The forest demanded a singular kind of devotion, a monastic lifestyle. I preferred the sound of the wind through the old growth to the sound of arguing in a cramped kitchen. The few times I came down from the mountains, the world felt too loud, too bright, too false. The only thing that made me feel real was the crunch of frozen earth under my boots at dawn, or the scent of damp moss clinging to a 1,000-year-old cedar. But that isolation bred competence. I was the guy they called when the weather went truly sideways, or when search and rescue operations were deemed too risky for the weekend volunteers. That competence was what kept me alive, and eventually, it was what dragged me into the periphery of Project Terminus. I noticed the shifts long before I pieced together the conspiracy. It started subtly, maybe 2 years before the actual hard closure. It wasn't the usual illegal logging operations, which were loud and obvious. This was silent. It was too efficient. My trigger event, the thing that cracked the veneer of my routine, happened during a routine perimeter sweep near what the locals vaguely called the High Bench. This was above the 7,000-foot line, an area rarely accessed even by hunters because the terrain was treacherous, a broken, volcanic landscape laced with ancient lava tubes and choked by perpetual fog in the colder months. I was surveying a known choke point, logging coordinates for a future fire break, when my radio crackled to life with a frequency I had never heard before. A tight digital burst, almost a coded language, followed by complete total silence. It wasn't the standard Forest Service chatter, nor was it amateur radio. It was military-grade, encrypted, and emanating from a location deep inside the restricted zone. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the one that tells a seasoned woodsman that the environment has shifted from dangerous to malevolent. My knees didn't exactly weaken, but the strength went out of the joints, replaced by a nervous energy that vibrated up my spine. The air, usually crisp with ozone and fur, had a strange metallic tang, like old battery acid mixed with rain. I parked the service truck, a rattling, beat-up Ford, and decided to proceed on foot. This was against protocol. You don't go off-grid alone in that sector. But the urgency in that silent frequency told me that protocol was already obsolete. What followed was the beginning of the layered reveals, the evidence that screamed against the official line. The first layer was purely sensory, the smell. It intensified as I hiked closer to the high bench, a complex layered odor that defied definition. It wasn't the sweet musky rot of a decaying deer carcass, and it wasn't the acrid funk of a bear den. It was ancient, earthy, and strangely sweet, like highly concentrated pine sap mixed with wet, thick fur and ozone. It was the scent of intelligence and immense physical mass, but overlaying it was something else. A manufactured, artificial smell, the faint chlorine and plastic odor of fresh military equipment. The silence was the second clue. Absolute, terrifying silence. No birdsong, no wind chimes in the pine needles. Even the mountain insects, the aggressive gnats that usually swarmed the high plateaus, were gone. The forest floor was unnaturally still, as if the entire biome had received a silent, universal command to hold its breath. It was the kind of silence that precedes catastrophic violence, the quiet before the artillery barrage. When I reached the lower slope leading toward the bench, I encountered the physical evidence, the second layer of the horrifying truth. This wasn't vandalism or simple territorial marking. This was defensive engineering. I found a series of broken snags, dead trees snapped clean off, not by wind, but by incredible force. The breaks weren't haphazard. They were angled and laid out to create deliberate, low-profile barriers, interwoven with thick, almost impenetrable layers of thorny underbrush. These weren't random windfalls. These were obstacles constructed to slow down mechanized infantry. And then I saw the footprints. I had seen tracks before hundreds of times, and I had dismissed the Bigfoot stories with the comfortable cynicism of a working ranger. Bear prints were easy. Mountain lion was recognizable. But these prints, pressed into the damp, thawing spring earth, defied taxonomy. They were impossibly long, nearly 17 inches, and wide, but they didn't have the clumsy, splayed quality of a primate. The arch was distinct, the toe configuration organized, and the heel strike was massive, suggesting a bipedal gait that was utterly efficient. The sheer weight indicated a creature far heavier than any known animal in North America. But the stride length suggested grace, not lumbering power. But what truly chilled me were the stone arrangements near the prints. These were the third layer of behavioral signs. Not simple stone stacks left by bored hikers. These were intricate, almost symbolic patterns, 3 specific stones placed on a larger flat rock, pointed toward the restricted zone. They looked like ancient directional markers, or maybe a warning. They felt deliberate, intelligent, and imbued with thousands of years of observation. The official explanation arrived via a terse, poorly edited memo rooted down from the regional office, signed by someone I had never heard of, Deputy Assistant Director K. Selwyn. It was titled, Phase 0 Environmental Remediation and Provisional Training Exercise. It read, due to newly discovered hazardous material leakage from abandoned Cold War-era research facilities classified, the High Bench Sector 12 and all adjacent zones are restricted until further notice. Military personnel and specialized civilian contractors are initiating necessary cleanup protocols. Local enforcement is advised to maintain strict distance. Any unauthorized entry will be treated as interference with federal operations and prosecuted. I knew it was garbage. We were 300 miles from the nearest known Cold War site. The mention of hazardous material leakage was the standard bureaucratic smokescreen used to justify any large-scale, secretive federal presence. When the feds invoke vague environmental concerns, it usually means they are trying to bury something massive. They weren't cleaning up, they were establishing a perimeter. But the most disturbing realization was the behavioral sign. The colony knew. They knew the military was coming and they were preparing their own battlefield. The intentional clearing of wildlife, the strategically placed barriers, it wasn't panic. It was calculated defense. My conscience, long dulled by routine and loneliness, began to prickle with a terrible sense of obligation. I wasn't supposed to believe the legends, but I couldn't ignore the empirical evidence of a highly organized, non-human intelligence facing imminent threat. I decided to go in deeper. I had to see what Project Terminus really meant. I returned to the choke point under the cover of a dense, freezing fog that rolled in from the Pacific crest, a fog so thick it condensed on my eyebrows and made the world shrink to the radius of my flashlight beam. My heart was pounding, a thick, visceral drumming that felt loud enough to betray me. Every snap of a twig sounded like a rifle shot. I navigated using the sun's position from earlier and the slight downward slope of the terrain, moving through the colony's defensive line. The barriers were even more sophisticated closer in, incorporating natural depressions and camouflaged pitfalls. This wasn't random placement. This was centuries of survival knowledge applied to modern threat assessment. Then, I saw the confrontation starting to take shape. I crested a small ridge and dropped to my belly, pulling my binoculars up. Below me, in a flat, bowl-shaped clearing about 200 yards across, the federal operation was evident. There were no tanks, no Humvees. This was too quiet for that. Instead, there were about a dozen black specialized ATVs, highly modified for silence and rugged terrain, parked around 3 large portable geodesic domes. The men, they weren't standard army. They wore dark gray, nondescript tactical gear, with no identifiable patches. Contractors, or a specialized unit. They were setting up large, tripod-mounted devices that looked too complicated to be simple cameras. They were directional parabolic antennae, capable of tracking movement through incredibly dense forest cover, probably using extremely low-frequency acoustic signatures. They weren't hunting. They were locating and isolating. But my attention was quickly stolen by the other side. The edge of the clearing opposite the feds was bordered by massive, ancient cedars, and something was moving among those trees. It wasn't fast. It was stately, silent. Through the fog, I caught my first clear glimpse of the defenders of the Cascade colony. They were tall, impossibly broad-shouldered, and their coats, a dark, almost charcoal brown, seemed to absorb the meager light. They were standing perfectly still, like monuments of muscle and fur, scattered irregularly along the tree line, watching the federal team work. There were maybe 7 of them visible, and their positioning suggested a tactical perimeter, not a random gathering. They weren't wielding weapons, but they didn't need to. Their presence was the weapon. I watched, holding my breath until my lungs burned as one of the figures shifted slightly. It was perhaps the largest I had ever imagined, towering easily over 8 feet. Its head turned slowly, deliberately, not toward the contractors, but toward me. For a terrifying, endless second, I felt the full weight of its ancient attention settle on my hiding spot. The fog, the cold, the military hardware, it all dissolved. There was only me, pressed into the icy dirt, and that enormous, intelligent presence across the clearing. That moment was the heart of the story, the terrifying realization that I was caught between 2 highly organized forces, one technological, the other primal, both operating outside the laws of man. I realized with sickening certainty, the feds weren't hunting a monster. They were hunting an intelligence sophisticated enough to have survived millennia, capable of complex defense, and now trapped in its final ancestral homeland. Project Terminus wasn't a cleanup. It was an extermination order against a civilization that predated us all. I pressed my face into the cold earth, terrified that the giant creature's gaze had seen through the fog and straight into my fragile human soul. I had not yet met them face to face, but I had seen enough to know that the colony was real, and that the feds were planning something far worse than capture. They were planning silence. The fear was sharp, but the guilt was heavier. Guilt that I, as a representative of the world outside, had allowed this encroachment to happen on my watch. I was in too deep now. The old life was gone. I was either going to report what I saw and be destroyed by the government, or I was going to keep silent and be destroyed by my own memory. Some things in those woods were never meant for us, but they're still out there, waiting. If this story moved you, consider subscribing. Stay safe out there. They didn't just want the territory, they wanted the memory erased. 40 years later, the stench of diesel and burnt pine still haunts my sleep, mingling with a smell far older, far colder, a scent I learned to associate with wet granite and absolute dread. The official files of Project Terminus called them biological anomalies, a sterile, dehumanizing term meant to make the coming destruction easier to rationalize. We knew better. We knew what we were trying to destroy, or at least, I slowly came to realize the scale of the living history we were tasked with terminating. How much silence does it take to bury a truth this sharp, this ancient? It turns out you need the full weight of the federal government and the complicity of broken men like me to even begin trying. Before we begin, consider subscribing and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. When Project Terminus began its aggressive phase, I was not yet fully broken. I was Dr. Alistair Vance, a 42-year-old remote ecology analyst specializing in high-altitude flora and fauna resilience. I was a man of charts, spectral analysis, and data points, not conspiracy. I was brought onto the initial phase under the highly classified but plausible cover of an environmental impact assessment for a proposed deep rock tunneling project. The official story for why heavy machinery and specialized military engineers were poking around the most sensitive, protected areas of the northern Cascades. My personal life was already a wreckage. My ex-wife Sarah had left me 5 years prior, weary of the silence, the long months of isolation, and the increasing paranoia I developed after my first deep field assignments, where things simply didn't add up. She said I loved the mountains more than I loved her, and perhaps she was right, because the mountains, at least, always told the truth eventually, albeit a horrifying one. I sought solace in logic, in the cold, hard certainty of numbers, believing that if I could quantify the natural world, I could control the chaos within myself. My guilt today stems from the precise moment I stopped being an impartial scientist and started being a useful idiot for Terminus. My job, ostensibly, was to map the biodiversity hot zones so the tunneling could avoid critical habitats. In reality, I was mapping the operational perimeter of the last Cascade colony. I realized this shift early in the second month, when the military logistics specialists began filtering my data. They weren't interested in the spotted owl nests or the rare orchids. They were obsessively focused on high-altitude spring access points, specific mineral deposits, and the boundaries of old-growth stands that offered natural camouflage and insulation. They were mapping a sustainable civilization, not a random animal population. The trigger event occurred on a routine flyover of Sector Gamma, a deeply fissured gorge known locally as the Watchman's Throat. It was a place of impossible silence. Even the wind seemed to detour around its entrance. We were using LiDAR to penetrate the dense canopy, looking for signs of geological instability. What the LiDAR revealed wasn't instability, but structure. Not geological formations, but deliberate patterned alignments. I was hunched over the monitor in the temporary mobile command unit, the diesel generator humming a monotonous rhythm outside, when the images stabilized. At first, I dismissed them as natural rock slides or perhaps forgotten mining relics, but the alignments were too precise. Large basalt stones, weighing hundreds of pounds, were arranged in concentric ovals and spirals on a high, nearly inaccessible shelf, almost 8,000 feet up. My hands began to tremble, betraying the scientific detachment I desperately clung to. Miners don't build megaliths, and certainly not in a region that history confirmed had never hosted permanent human settlements. I demanded a ground team insertion. Colonel Hayes, the chief military liaison, a man whose eyes held the weary, cynical knowledge of countless dark operations, objected immediately, citing unnecessary risk escalation. I pushed back, leveraging my academic credibility, arguing that these structures represented an unprecedented archaeological find that needed immediate preservation. stalling the imaginary tunneling project. Hayes finally relented, giving me 3 hours, accompanied by 2 silent, heavily armed operatives who were clearly there to monitor me, not protect me. The ascent to the watchman's throat was brutal. The air thinned and the silence intensified, becoming a physical pressure against the eardrums. As we breached the shelf, the sensory clues overwhelmed my attempt at professional objectivity. The first layer of realization struck purely through the senses. There was a smell. It wasn't the sweet, rotting decomposition of typical wild animals, nor was it the sterile odor of high-altitude rock. It was an ancient, oily musk, thick and complex, like ozone after a lightning strike mixed with the metallic scent of wet blood and something deeply sweet, akin to burnt brown sugar. It was the scent of intelligence housed in immense power, a signature I would later recognize instantly, filling my lungs with dread and recognition. We found the physical evidence almost immediately. The basalt megaliths were there, cold and moss-covered, but they were not random. They were markers. Embedded within the soil around the stones were other arrangements, bone altars, though not of human origin, carefully bleached and placed. They were the skeletal remains of large deer and elk, meticulously stripped and positioned to point towards the cardinal directions, but also towards the lower forested valleys, where the heavy equipment was stationed. This was surveillance, or perhaps ceremony designed to ward off an invasion. The second, more terrifying layer of physical evidence was the knotwork. Strands of thick, resilient vine and root fiber, intricately woven into complex patterns and tied to branches at impossible heights, 12, 15 feet above the ground. These were not the haphazard trails of a foraging beast. These were signals, borders, and perhaps a form of communication. I recognized elements of ancient nautical knotting mixed with geometric complexity that seemed beyond intuitive creation. It suggested abstract thought, planning and continuity, a cultural lineage. As I photographed the knots, one of the silent operatives, a man named Miller, kicked at a pile of pine needles nearby. Underneath, we found what looked like a tool, a polished stone hand axe, perfectly balanced, made of a stone not naturally found within 50 miles. Miller dismissed it, his voice flat and unemotional. Native American relic, probably displaced. I looked at him. The stone was pristine, the cutting edge honed recently, the residue on the handle suggesting it had been handled by something with immense grip and size, not the fine motor skills of human hands. I knew then. The last Cascade colony was a society, not a population. The third layer of reveal was behavioral, and it focused squarely on me. My specialized radio equipment, designed for ultra-high frequency transmission, began to fail erratically, specifically whenever I moved close to the stone structures. The signal wouldn't just drop. It was corrupted by a low rhythmic pulse, almost like heavy, slow breathing captured electronically. It wasn't atmospheric interference. It was localized disruption. I looked up towards the dense, upper ridge line. I felt the cold, unwavering pressure of being observed. Not hunted, but assessed, judged, measured. The forest hadn't gone silent because the creatures weren't there. It had gone silent because they were waiting for us to leave, holding their collective breath. When we returned to base camp, Colonel Hayes listened to my report with the weary patience of a man who already knew the script. I presented the LiDAR images, the photographs of the stone markers, the knots, the sophisticated tool. I detailed the complexity and argued that what we were observing demanded anthropological study, not military intervention. Hayes offered the partial, official explanation, his voice a low, gravelly monotone, devoid of inflection. Dr. Vance, your enthusiasm is noted. The analysis concludes that these are highly unusual but explainable phenomena. The stone arrangements are the result of frost heave and geological stress. The knots? High-altitude foraging bears exhibiting unusual dexterity due to starvation. We've seen similar behavior in the Kodiak region. The radio interference is an expected anomaly in this dense, highly mineralized environment. I gripped the edge of the metal table until my knuckles turned white. Colonel, the knots are complex slip knots used for load bearing. Bears don't do that. And the LIDAR shows these structures were intentionally placed and maintained. This is a complex, sentient population, maybe hominid, maybe something older. We are talking about a unique cultural resource, possibly the last of its kind. We cannot proceed with Project Terminus until this is fully investigated. Hayes leaned forward, finally dropping the facade of bureaucracy. His eyes were cold, like chips of blue ice. Doctor, you were brought in to assess the environmental impact of the tunneling project, which, as you know, is a matter of national security involving strategic resource access. Your role is advisory. We appreciate your findings on the local fauna, but the operation proceeds in 48 hours. All data concerning anomalies has been filed, sealed, and transferred to a secure facility. You are hereby ordered to stand down, finalize your reports on local bird populations, and prepare for immediate extraction. It was a threat cloaked in procedure. My data, my proof, was already being erased. I realized that my moral injury was complete. I had cataloged the victims for the executioner. The next 36 hours were a blur of cold panic. I was isolated, watched by the same silent operatives, treated like a containment risk. I couldn't sleep. The guilt was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, the image of those precise, silent stone circles burning behind my eyelids. I knew that in 48 hours, the full military weight, acoustic deterrence, thermal imaging sweeps, and eventually, the lethal countermeasures, would descend on the watchman's throat. I couldn't live with that. Not after seeing the evidence of their antiquity and their tragic, fragile intelligence. Just before midnight, I staged a deliberate power failure in my isolated annex, enough to buy myself a 20-minute window. I grabbed my camera, a high-powered thermal monocular, and a small specialized sensor array. I was going back to the epicenter. I had to find irrefutable, undeniable proof that would stop even a man like Hayes. I raced down the fire roads in a stolen, unmarked Forest Service Jeep, the cold mountain air screaming past the window. I reached the base of the caldera an hour later. The fog had rolled in thick and white, smelling of ice and decay, muffling every sound. This was the heart of the story, the place where everything logical died. I moved on foot, relying on the GPS coordinates I had memorized from the LIDAR maps. The tension was suffocating. My heartbeat was loud, a frantic drum against the silence. I could hear the distant, growing, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of heavy transport helicopters already moving into position on the far ridgeline, preparing for the dawn strike. I was racing the clock, racing the coming genocide. I finally reached the crest of the shelf where the stone circles lay. The fog was so dense I could barely see my own feet, but the smell, that complex ancient musk, was overwhelming here, a thick, oily cloud of presence. I activated the thermal monocular. I wasn't looking for heat signatures of creatures. I was looking for the sophistication Hayes denied, and I found it. Not 20 yards from the primary altar, concealed by a seemingly natural overhang of rock and roots, was a structure. It was a shelter, perfectly integrated into the environment, invisible to the naked eye, but glowing faintly in the thermal scope. It was meticulously lined with insulating moss and woven bark, designed to retain maximum heat and minimize environmental impact. It wasn't primitive, it was optimized. I crouched low, breathing shallowly, listening to the muffled thrumming of the approaching air armada. I crawled closer to the opening of the shelter. It was empty. They knew we were coming. They had evacuated, but they had left their record. Inside the small, meticulously maintained space on a smooth, flat piece of slate were carved symbols. They weren't letters, not hieroglyphs, but a complex, repetitive pattern of arcs and lines almost astronomical in configuration. It was a system of counting, of mapping, of notation. It was data storage. It was proof of a culture that existed outside of human history. Then, the true climax. I heard nothing. The heavy, rhythmic breathing that had corrupted my radio was suddenly real, impossibly close. It wasn't frantic. It was deep, slow, and powerful, like the sound of a whale surfacing. The smell intensified, burning my sinuses. I slowly turned, the thermal scope pressed to my eye. And there it was. It stood maybe 15 feet away, perfectly framed by the swirling white fog. It was enormous, dark, and utterly still. It was not a bear, nor a man. Its eyes, catching the faint reflection of the thermal light, were the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed. They weren't red or demonic, but deep amber, immense and filled with a profound ancient sorrow. They were the eyes of something that had seen millennia pass, that had observed the rise and fall of countless species, and now saw its own termination approaching in the guise of my presence. It wasn't aggressive. It didn't roar. It simply looked at me, the scientist who had charted its home for destruction. It saw the camera, the scope, the human technology that was its doom. And then, it slowly, deliberately, raised its hand. A huge, powerful appendage that ended in fingers more human than ape, and pointed not towards me but towards the valley floor where the Terminus Command Center was located. It was a gesture of warning, a statement of knowledge. It knew I was the scout, the prelude to the attack. In that paralyzed moment, time collapsed. I wasn't Dr. Vance anymore. I was a betrayer, the man who brought the enemy to the gates of the last sanctuary. The feeling of intelligence radiating from its silent, immense form was so potent that it crushed my scientific certainty and replaced it with stark spiritual terror. It was communicating, not through sound, but through sheer presence, telling me, "Leave. You have already failed us. Your time is over." I stumbled backward, dropping the thermal scope. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I ran, fueled by shame and pure terror, the image of those immense, mournful amber eyes searing into my memory. I raced back to the Jeep, leaving the shelter, the culture, and the absolute truth of Project Terminus behind me. I tried to radio a desperate coded warning as soon as I was clear of the magnetic anomalies, but the transmission was immediately intercepted. I was apprehended 20 minutes later by the Terminus Rapid Deployment Team. They found me shaking, babbling about star charts and weeping about my lost objectivity. My data, my final terrifying photographs of the structure and the stone notation, were seized immediately. I was quietly discharged under mandatory psychological evaluation, my career ruined, my credibility shattered. Labeled a classic case of high-altitude psychosis triggered by trauma, Colonel Hayes ensured I was silenced, not with bullets, but with the bureaucratic death sentence of psychiatric unreliability. I carried the weight of the genocide, the guilt of the scientist who surveyed the field for the slaughter. I knew the Cascade colony was gone, or at least scattered to the winds, because of the data I provided. Some things in those woods were never meant for us. They were civilizations outside our narrow comprehension, ancient and wise. And they are still out there, waiting for the inevitable return of the Terminus agenda. If this story moved you, consider subscribing. Stay safe out there. It's been 40 years, and the silence still burns hotter than any fire I ever fought. The quiet is the real memory, the heavy suffocating blanket they threw over the whole operation. I know now that the deepest forest isn't silent because there's nothing there. It's silent because the things living there are listening to you breathe, waiting for you to make the first mistake, waiting for you to betray them, just like I did. I carry the guilt of that silence every single day, the weight of knowing that I saw the edge of a truth so profound and ancient it should have redefined everything we thought we knew about this planet, and yet I allowed men in dark suits to bury it under cheap concrete and official lies. They didn't just want the territory, they wanted the memory of the Cascade colony erased from time itself. Before we begin, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. The years have done their work on me. My hands shake constantly now, not from the cold of those mountain nights, but from the echoes of what I witnessed. I am not the vigorous ranger Elias was 30, 40 years ago. That man died somewhere deep in the Olympic National Forest near the western shelf of the Cascades, the moment he realized the scope of the conspiracy. I was a broken cog in their massive, grinding machinery, a man who prided himself on knowing every inch of those woods only to discover I knew nothing at all, merely the shallow surface. My marriage dissolved into a series of bitter whispers and empty rooms long before the real crisis hit. My wife, bless her pragmatic soul, Never understood the cold terror of the endless night watches, the smell of burnt cedar mixed with something metallic and wrong. When I started talking about the unmarked choppers and the way the animals vanished wholesale, not migrating, but simply gone, she saw a man losing his mind, not a man finding the terrible, devastating truth. The forest was the only family I had left, and when I realized they were poisoning it, sterilizing it, trying to render it uninhabitable, the isolation became absolute. It was a loneliness that permeated the bone marrow. The initial disturbance, the trigger, had evolved past simple sightings or strange noises. It had become tactical. I was no longer tracking something elusive. I was tracking two armies, the ancient inhabitants, moving with terrifying intelligence and coordination, and the federal units, operating under the umbrella of Project Terminus. The term itself, Terminus, had leaked out of a shredded map I found tucked beneath a deadfall of Douglas fir, wrapped in government-issued nylon tarp. Terminus, the final point, the end of the line. Their goal was genocide masked as environmental remediation. They wanted the last known colony gone, and now, I was standing in the peripheral boundary of that last sanctuary, a place where the trees grew too close together, their trunks scarred by weather and time, forming a living wall. The shift in atmosphere was immediate and visceral, a pressure change that felt less about altitude and more about expectation. The scent was the first layer. It wasn't the sweet, heavy musk I associated with the creature, the smell of wet earth, wood smoke, and slightly overripe fruit. This was overlaid with something clinical, something that didn't belong. It was the sterile, acrid odor of industrial solvent, faint but pervasive, mixed with ozone, as if high-powered electrical equipment had been running non-stop nearby. I knelt down, pressing my gloved fingers into the moss. It felt wrong, too dry in patches where it should have been saturated, unnaturally green in others. Then came the physical evidence, the second layer, and this is where the fear transcended the creature and settled squarely on my own species. I wasn't finding broken branches and gigantic footprints anymore. I was finding small, nearly invisible tripwires, disconnected surveillance feeds disguised as geological markers, and small pits where the soil had been replaced entirely. The feds were laying a siege, not merely performing reconnaissance, but the most chilling physical evidence was the response of the inhabitants. I found rock cairns that were not typical of the region. These were not primitive burial markers or navigational aids. They were complex, structurally sound pillars of flat, heavy basalt, stacked with impossible precision. And on the surface of these rocks there were symbols, not runes, not language as we define it, but deep, etched glyphs that reminded me of cave markings, symbols of containment, of warning. They radiated an immense, silent age. They weren't meant to scare a hiker. They were meant to designate a perimeter that human technology could not breach, or perhaps should not breach. Beside one of these massive rock stacks near a small frozen stream, I found a piece of torn canvas, heavily treated military grade, caught on a snagged thorn. Beneath it, the creature had left its own sign, a series of interlocking, carefully laid branches forming a massive 6-foot-wide spiral pattern. It was sophisticated. It was deliberate. The behavioral signs, the third layer, were the most terrifying because they proved communication was ongoing and highly intelligent. The Cascade colony wasn't just hiding, it was adapting to the siege. In the previous weeks, I had tracked several small teams of federal contractors, the ones without the dark suits, the expendables, who were installing specialized sonic emitters, designed, I surmised, to disrupt the creature's low-frequency communication, their way of talking through the earth and the roots. Every single one of these emitters I found was disabled, not smashed in a fit of primitive rage, but meticulously dismantled. Wires cut cleanly, batteries drained and placed in neat stacks 20 feet away, the metallic casing cracked open as if studied, analyzed, and then rendered inert. They were learning the technology designed to eradicate them. They understood the objective of Project Terminus. Then I found the warning. I was crossing a narrow deer path, flanked by dense scrub, when I stumbled. I didn't trip over a root. I tripped over a small bundled collection of personal items, a high-end compass, a small field knife, and a worn leather wallet belonging to a contract surveyor named Jennings. Jennings had gone missing 2 weeks prior, officially listed as a lost hiker, despite his high-level training. The creature had laid Jennings' gear out like a display on a bed of ferns. The wallet was open. Everything was still inside. Nothing was taken, save for one thing. Jennings' standard-issue map of the exclusion zone was gone. The message was clear. We took his knowledge, but we left the body of the crime intact to prove we could reach him. The creature wasn't attacking humans indiscriminately. It was neutralizing the immediate threat, specifically the people mapping their boundaries and installing the elimination tech. It was protecting its territory with surgical precision. This wasn't a beast, it was a counterinsurgent force. This was the Cascade colony. The truth began to coalesce, sticky and ugly, like swamp mud. This wasn't a simple cover-up of a cryptid sighting. This was about something fundamental that the colony possessed or protected, something so valuable or so dangerous to the established world order that the U.S. government was willing to violate every ecological and ethical boundary to seize it. The partial explanation provided by the handful of compromised local officials was almost laughable in its inadequacy, but effective enough for the evening news. Sheriff Hawthorne, a good man driven to desperation by federal pressure, told me over a lukewarm cup of coffee at the station that the activity was linked to remediation efforts following the discovery of high-yield cadmium in groundwater runoff from an old forgotten mine shaft in the upper region. He spoke of an emergency EPA mandate, citing public health concerns and the need for immediate restricted access to the zone. He said the choppers were airlifting specialized equipment, and the heavy military presence was simply protective security for the expensive machinery. When I looked him in the eye, Hawthorne, who I'd known since we were boys, I saw the lies shimmering there like oil on water. Cadmium, Sheriff? I asked, my voice flat. Cadmium doesn't require 5 miles of electrified fence buried 2 feet deep. Cadmium doesn't require sonic weaponry designed to scatter wildlife populations, and cadmium doesn't account for the fact that the real activity, the heavy patrols, the men in those Kevlar vests, are all centered miles away from that mine, right around the ancient rock formations. Hawthorne simply looked down at his chipped mug. Elias, stop looking, just stop, go home. Take the early retirement package. You don't want to see what happens when the EPA gets serious about public safety. He used the term EPA. But I knew the actual player was buried several layers deeper than environmental protection. The term Project Terminus felt less like a code name and more like a declaration of intent carved into marble. I couldn't stop. The knowledge of the colony, their intelligence, their ancient methods of defense, their absolute right to exist, compelled me forward, drawing me inevitably toward the confrontation. I returned to the central area. The place I suspected was the true heart of the Cascade colony, located in a high, fog-shrouded bowl that locals had always called the Valley of the Forgotten. It was a difficult hike, requiring me to bypass several checkpoints that the feds had established. Areas where the air tasted metallic and the silence was so profound it buzzed in my ears. The closer I got, the more the forest seemed to reject me. The ground became uneven, the fog thick and cloying, muffling sound and distorting light. My heartbeat was a frantic drum solo against the overwhelming stillness. I moved like a ghost, relying on the old ranger training to step where the leaves wouldn't crunch, to breathe shallowly, trying to mimic the environment's absolute stealth. I reached the lip of the valley just after the sun had dipped, leaving the world bruised purple and gray. And then I saw it. The heart of the colony. It wasn't a village, nor was it a cave dwelling. It was a massive natural amphitheater, protected by sheer rock faces. And in the center there was an unmistakable concentration of life. I saw shadows moving, but they were not the single, massive shapes I had previously encountered. These were multiple individuals moving with purpose, gathering, communicating. The emotional weight hit me. This was a family, a society, fighting for survival. What truly horrified me, though, wasn't the presence of the creatures but the evidence of the Fed's final, terrifying move. Spanning the valley entrance, partially camouflaged by netting, was a continuous barrier. Not electrified wire, but a complex series of metallic pylons spaced perhaps 50 yards apart. They pulsed with a faint, almost invisible light, humming a tone too low for human ears to register, but I could feel the vibration in my teeth. These were the sonic emitters, but these weren't simple noisemakers. These were precision instruments. I raised my binoculars, my hand steady now despite the fear, focused by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. I scanned the perimeter, searching for an active patrol, but there was only the humming and the fog. Then, through a brief thinning of the haze, I saw the objective of Project Terminus. It wasn't just to drive them out. It was to trap them in. In the center of the natural bowl, shielded by the creature's own bodies, was something massive and dark. At first I thought it was a large natural stone structure, but the geometry was too precise. It had been partially obscured by centuries of moss and growth, but the underlying material was jet black and impossibly smooth. It looked like obsidian, but on a geological scale. It was radiating a low, throbbing energy that the sonic emitters were specifically positioned to suppress, to contain. The creatures, the Cascade colony, were gathered around this structure, moving with reverence, almost ritualistically. It clicked into agonizing focus. Project Terminus wasn't about the creatures themselves, not primarily. They were merely the guardians. The feds wanted whatever that structure was. An energy source? A cache of ancient non-human knowledge? A portal? I watched one of the towering shadows approach the obsidian surface. The creature reached out a huge, powerful hand, not to strike, but to touch the surface with an almost agonizing tenderness. And as it did, a brief pulse of light, a soft internal luminescence, green and ancient, flashed deep within the stone, responding to the touch. The creature's head was bowed, communicating not through sound, but through contact. It was receiving or transmitting something foundational. The feds hadn't labeled this operation Project Terminus because they wanted to finish off a wild animal population. They named it Terminus because they were attempting to seize the origin point of something magnificent, something that defied human understanding of physics and history. The creatures were the last line of defense for a power or a truth that they had guarded for millennia. The feds were planning to either steal it or destroy it entirely, ending that lineage, the colony, forever. My breath condensed in the cold air, visible proof of my intrusion. I had to get closer. I needed to understand what that stone was, what those symbols meant, and why the government would risk everything to silence the guardians of the last Cascade colony. I felt a tremendous, agonizing responsibility blooming in my chest. I wasn't just a witness anymore. I was now inescapably a participant in the defense of a sacred ancient trust. The fog was deepening again, and I started moving down the slope, driven by a terrible urgency and a deep sense of moral trespass against my own kind. The siege was active. The confrontation was imminent. And I knew, with chilling certainty, that I was not the only one watching the valley tonight. Someone or something was waiting for me to make my move. The sheer scale of their operation was obscene. They didn't come to study the forest. They came to sterilize it. It was a cleansing, clinical, and absolute, disguised under the sickly sweet scent of high-grade diesel and freshly disturbed earth. How do you confess to knowing, intimately, what the government was planning and doing nothing until the point of no return? I carry the weight of every silent witness they wiped out in that valley. It wasn't just a colony they were destroying. It was a sanctuary, the last one, and I watched them put the knife in. Before we begin, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I was no longer the conflicted biologist, the man who split his loyalties between the data and the raw instinct screaming in his gut. By the time the fourth convoy rolled in, establishing a perimeter so tight the very air felt pressurized, I had become something else entirely, a ghost in my own woods, an intelligence asset who lacked the courage to defect. Every night I would lie awake in that derelict fire lookout, miles from the action but close enough to hear the low, insistent thrumming of their generators, and I would try to reconcile the man who submitted the initial study notes with the man who was now watching the methodical dismantling of the ecosystem he swore to protect. My marriage was already ashes, my career already a mockery. All that was left was the lingering metallic taste of fear and the guilt that bound me to that unforgiving landscape. I had provided the initial coordinates for the anomalous biodiversity cluster, the Cascade colony, and now those same coordinates were stamped onto classified tactical maps. The disturbance wasn't a sudden jolt, but a slow, suffocating compression. It started with the silence. Days before the first military-grade fence went up, the woods went mute. The owls stopped their nightly conversations. The deer vanished in the high-frequency chirping of insects. The constant, invisible soundtrack of the deep forest just evaporated. It was the sound of a vacuum sealing. Then came the physical manifestation. Massive, temporary structures rising out of the mist like skeletal behemoths, surrounded by razor wire and guarded by men in unmarked heavy-duty tactical gear. Not Forest Service, not National Guard, but something harder, quieter, and fundamentally hostile. The sheer expense, the speed of deployment told me instantly that this wasn't about a missing hiker or a wildfire. This was Project Terminus, fully activated. My own observation posts became hazardous. I had to move laterally, sticking to old logging trails that were long overgrown, relying on a sense of spatial memory I hadn't needed since my 20s. It was during one of these deep incursions, trying to skirt the eastern sector near the geothermal vent the colony used for warmth, that the first layered reveals began to surface, proving that the creatures were not just reacting to the threat. They were strategically defending their core asset. The sensory clues were the most immediate and disturbing. The customary thick, earthy musk of the Sasquatch, a smell of wet fur, fermented moss, and something anciently sweet, was now overlaid with a sharp synthetic stench. It was ozone, burnt wiring, and the bitter scent of industrial cleaning solvents. They were deploying technology designed to disrupt biological camouflage and thermal signatures. But the creature's communication had shifted dramatically. I no longer heard the territorial, guttural moans. Instead, deep within the valley, I started picking up rhythmic, percussive sounds. They were loud, deliberate knocks on large standing timbers. 3 short, 2 long. 5 short, 1 long. It wasn't random tree knocking. It was pattern recognition, almost like a localized, organic form of Morse code, strategically placed along the perimeter of the military's forward operating bases. It sounded like they were coordinating defenses, broadcasting warnings, or perhaps even marking the precise positions of the enemy's vulnerability. My blood ran cold realizing they were using the noise of the military construction to mask their own signals. The physical evidence I encountered deepened the horror. This wasn't just a group of large primates running scared. The feds were digging. They weren't just clearing timber, they were excavating. Near the deepest gorge, a spot I knew was central to the colony's seasonal migrations, I found a series of complex, interlocked stone cairns. They weren't natural formations. They were deliberately placed, creating a triangular shield around a small fissure in the rock. More telling was the destruction around them. Military-grade cutting tools had clearly been used to dismantle these formations. But there were also signs of immense brute force, large boulders tossed aside like pebbles, not by machinery, but by deliberate organic power. One piece of evidence chilled me to the bone, a discarded heavy-duty thermal sensor, its casing crushed inward, almost perfectly flat with 3 distinct parallel indentations across the metal. No bear could manage that pressure, nor the geometry of the strike. This led to the third layer of revelation, the behavioral signs that pointed toward a desperate, intelligent, and highly protective strategy. They weren't attacking the perimeter soldiers, at least not yet. They were engaging in strategic misdirection and silent warning. I started finding small items on my trail, things that shouldn't be there. A specific type of petrified wood found only deep in the old growth, or a piece of reflective, polished obsidian. They weren't threats. They were markers. They were guiding me, deliberately nudging me away from newly installed camera traps or patrols, recognizing me as the lesser threat, perhaps even recognizing the scent of the man who had only observed and never hunted. The trauma intensified because I realized I was being protected by the very creatures the government was trying to eradicate, and my presence, the information I carried, was deemed valuable enough for them to risk exposure. Meanwhile, the official explanation being disseminated by the limited, controlled media releases, managed through the sheriff's office miles away and the regional Forest Service office, was laughably thin, yet effective for mass consumption. They claimed they were conducting a massive, highly sensitive biohazard containment operation. The story went that a newly discovered zoonotic pathogen, highly aggressive and potentially airborne, had been found concentrated in the region's indigenous wildlife population, a classic wild animal reservoir narrative. They were sealing off the area, performing large-scale sterilization, and conducting mandatory testing on all captured specimens. They played on the public's fear of pandemic, justifying the intense military presence and the non-disclosure agreements under the guise of national public health security. A few local elders, predictably, spoke of a large, aggressive mountain cat population driven mad by a regional drought, but even they looked pale and uneasy delivering the lines they were clearly instructed to read. But I knew the truth was far colder, far more material. The feds weren't worried about a virus. They were worried about control. My confrontation began when I decided to ignore the creature's warnings and push past the last known perimeter, aiming for the core Cascade structure, the place where the geothermal anomaly peaked. It was a late October morning and the air was dense and cold, thick with a fog that rolled down the mountain like viscous milk, muffling every sound of their industrial assault. The temperature drop was immediate, the humidity cloying, causing my breath to condense in hurried white plumes. I was crawling through a tight thicket of ancient salal, the heavy canvas of my gear dragging against the damp earth, when I heard the low, almost subsonic vibration of drilling rigs, not the clear sound of a petroleum drill, but the deeper, grinding frequency of rock excavation. They were digging down. My heart was beating so violently against my ribs I was sure the seismic monitors they had deployed would pick it up. The fear was physical, a deep, sickening lurch in my stomach that had me swallowing hard to keep from vomiting the dry crackers I had eaten hours before. I passed through a stretch of freshly turned earth, where the acidic smell of pulverized minerals was overwhelming. And then, I saw the notes. Tossed near a hastily abandoned temporary communications shelter were a few sheets of heavy, plasticized research paper, water-stained but still legible. They weren't field guides, they were data fragments. I forced myself to slow my breathing, hands shaking as I smoothed the pages. Keywords jumped out at me, stabbing into the flimsy facade of the biohazard lie. Localized thermal anomaly persistence. Non-radioactive energy signature output 1500% over modeled baseline. Biosignature shielding matrix observed in symbiotic relationship with indigenous organisms. The Cascade colony wasn't just a place they lived. It was a structure they protected, built around an incredible, untapped power source, perhaps ancient geothermal heat, or something far stranger, which they somehow utilized or maintained. The creatures were not the target. They were the guardians, and I had led the destroyers right to the gate. I was so fixated on the papers, on the shattering reality of what I was reading, the true objective of Project Terminus, that I didn't hear the movement behind me until it was too late. Not the snap of a twig, not the sound of heavy boots, but a low, guttural sigh, a sound heavy with exhaustion and profound loss. It was standing just 20 feet away, partially obscured by the thick, swirling fog, between me and the main excavation site. The shadow was immense, broader than anything natural and perfectly still. The air grew immediately colder, heavier, and the deep, rich musk of the ancient creature flooded the air, overriding the metallic fear and the industrial stench. I froze, the paper slipping from my numb fingers, realizing I had just walked directly into the heart of the conflict. I was in the kill zone. The confrontation had begun, and I knew with a certainty that settled deep into my bones that I was not looking at an animal, but at a sentinel mourning its fate. The climax was upon me, and I was utterly, irrevocably alone. It's been 52 years since that night, and the air still catches in my throat whenever a helicopter flies too low over this small cabin. They say time heals wounds, but some wounds aren't meant to close. They are meant to be monuments to a truth too hideous to bear alone. I have carried the full weight of Project Terminus, the final fatal action taken against the Cascade colony, and it has been a chain dragging me through every waking moment. The silence I kept was a lie, and lies weigh more than mountains. I should have died that night. Perhaps that would have been the merciful ending. Instead, I lived to be the sole witness to a massacre driven by pure, bureaucratic, cold-blooded greed. Before we begin, consider subscribing. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. By the time the final phase of Terminus began, I was already a ghost of the man I had been. My life as a Forest Service veteran had evaporated, replaced by the obsessive, paranoid life of a whistleblower who had nothing left to blow. I had lost my marriage to the relentless pursuit of the truth behind the strange silence and the black ops happening in those remote corners of the North Cascades. My friends either thought I was crazy or had been forcefully reassigned. I was living out of a battered Ford pickup, fueled by stale coffee and a terror that had hardened into grim determination. I was 38 years old, physically worn down by exposure and lack of sleep, but mentally sharp, honed by the certainty that the government wasn't just covering up the existence of the creatures, they were actively engineering their demise. I had spent the previous months tracking the subtle shifts in the exclusion zone perimeter, listening to coded chatter, and noticing the geological survey teams that vanished as soon as the black helicopters appeared. My guilt was immense. I had seen the reports about the colony. I had dismissed the strange footprints decades ago as clever hoaxes. Now, I knew the colony wasn't just a handful of Sasquatch. It was a functioning society, a silent, ancient keeper of that land, potentially living alongside a very small, very private group of human hermits who understood the real ecology of the mountains. I realized then that Terminus wasn't just about clearance, it was about proprietary control over something they guarded. And on that final October night, the silence became absolute. The trigger event was not a sound, but the absence of sound. It was 3 a.m. The night was cold, clear, and perfectly still, the kind of stillness that nature only achieves just before a massive event, like the vacuum before a storm or the hush before a landslide. I was positioned on a ridge overlooking the deepest, most protected valley where the colony was rumored to congregate, a place the feds had designated Sector Prime. I had my radio scanner tuned to the frequency used by the Black Ops teams, though it was usually just static. At 3:12 a.m., the static stopped. There was a burst of compressed, encrypted digital chatter, followed by a sequence of 3 piercing, high-frequency tones. They were not human. They were signaling a warning or perhaps a final goodbye. Then, total, absolute, unrecoverable radio silence. Every channel I scanned, Forest Service, local sheriff, even amateur radio, was suddenly dead within a 50-mile radius. My stomach dropped out. I knew this was it. They weren't just pushing them out. They were sanitizing the area. A desperate, primal instinct screamed at me to turn back, to live, to forget. But the shame of knowing I could have prevented this, or at least documented it, drove me forward. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the rifle I carried purely for psychological comfort. I felt the cold, dry air on my neck and the hair stood up like needles. The old instinct, the one that whispers of ancient fear, was screaming, "This is not your world. Run." I moved down the steep slope, navigating the rugged terrain in near total darkness, illuminated only by a sliver of moon and the faint metallic scent of ozone already polluting the air. First layer, sensory clues. The smell hit me first, a sickening cocktail. It wasn't the sweet, deep musk of the creatures I had grown to recognize, nor the usual rot of the forest floor. This was chemical and sterile, mixed with the acrid stench of burning fuel and something organic, burnt and heavy. It smelled like industrial waste had been dropped onto a funeral pyre. There was no wind, yet the scent pressed down like a physical weight. The forest was dead silent, not just quiet, but drained of life, as if every bird, rodent, and insect had perished or fled instantaneously. Second layer, physical evidence. As I got closer to the valley floor, the evidence of conflict became sickeningly clear. Not traditional combat, but total demolition. Trees 50 feet tall had been shorn off near the base, not splintered by wind or logging, but cleanly cut, almost melted by immense concentrated heat. I found debris, fragments of specialized non-military grade explosive casings, something designed for deep earth penetration or cavern collapse. There were also massive broken trails in the underbrush, inconsistent with any known military vehicle. These trails were meters wide, radiating outward, indicating something huge had been moving with desperate, agonizing speed. I noticed large dark stains on the rocks, too thin to be mere blood, almost oily, shimmering under my weak flashlight beam. Third layer, behavioral signs. I found a stack of stones. It wasn't an altar, not like the cryptic bone piles I had seen before. This was a barricade. A final, futile attempt to block the narrow entrance to an ancient rock shelter, the sanctuary of the colony. The stones, many weighing hundreds of pounds, were expertly piled, yet they had been blasted apart, scattered across a wide radius. As I stepped over the rubble, I saw it. A small, carefully carved piece of obsidian, dull black, lying by itself. It was the only artifact I ever recovered from them. It felt ancient, radiating cold, protective energy. They hadn't run. They had tried to protect their home until the very end. 2 days later, when the feds finally relaxed the official quarantine, after the main cleanup was finished, the official story dropped like a shroud over the entire region. The cover was simple, comprehensive, and utterly horrifying in its audacity. Severe localized seismic activity combined with an unforeseen geological instability led to a massive, localized subterranean gas leak. Operation Terminus was a necessary ecological decontamination and resource stabilization effort to prevent regional catastrophic collapse. They explained away the melted foliage as thermal flares from the gas, the massive exclusion zones as ground stabilization efforts, and the lack of witnesses as rapid evacuation protocols. They turned an ancient, living civilization into a geological phenomenon. The local sheriff, the man who had always been a thorn in my side, stood by the feds, repeating the talking points with the glassy-eyed conviction of a man whose retirement fund had just been massively boosted. It was a perfect lie, impossible to disprove without admitting the existence of the colony itself. The world accepted the seismic activity report. They always prefer the familiar explanation, no matter how nonsensical the details. I knew the official story was filth. Driven by adrenaline, trauma, and a blinding need for definitive closure, I returned to Sector Prime one last time, ignoring the remaining patrol drones humming overhead. The valley floor was a tomb. It reeked of ash and tragedy. I followed the largest trail of destruction, which led not to the stone shelter but deeper to a cluster of colossal, impossibly old cedars, towering above the destruction like sentinels that had withstood a nuclear blast. My heart hammered against my ribs, a painful, loud beat in the pervasive silence. My breath condensed rapidly in the cold air. Every nerve ending screamed, knowing I was deep within the killing ground. I stepped into the shadow of the largest cedar and I saw her. Not an animal, not a beast. She was leaning against the trunk, vast and impossibly wounded. Blood, thick, viscous, and dark, coated her left side, steaming slightly against the chill of the evening. She was massive, easily 10 feet tall, her hide the color of wet earth and dark moss, but her structure was undeniably upright, regal and terrifyingly intelligent. Her head was bowed and her breathing was a shallow, painful rasp, tearing at the silence. This was the leader, the one referred to in hushed local legends as the Keeper of the Waters. She lifted her head slowly, painfully, and her eyes found mine. They were not glowing red like a predator's, nor dark like an ape's. They were deep amber, ancient, and flooded with a sorrow so immense it felt like cold water rushing into my own chest. She saw me not as a threat, but as an intrusion, a weak echo of the murderers who had just fled. I froze, unable to lift my rifle, Unable to move a muscle, I expected violence, or perhaps a warning roar. Instead, she performed an act of horrifying intimacy. With immense effort, she extended a hand the size of a shovel, but with fingers articulate and delicate despite the scale, and placed 2 of those massive digits directly onto my forehead. The moment the skin connected, time shattered. It wasn't a vision or a hallucination. It was a torrent of pure, unadulterated memory and sensory input, flooding my consciousness instantly. I didn't see images. I lived her memories. I saw millennia of existence in the valley, the patient cultivation of life, the understanding of geological rhythms, the deep, spiritual connection to the Earth's natural energy, a pulsing source deep beneath the ground that they had protected for centuries. I understood instantly that the colony weren't just isolated creatures. They were guardians of a latent geothermal geological power source, something elemental and potentially limitless, hidden deep within the fault lines of the Cascade Range. Then came the modern memories, the gradual encroachment, the persistent probing of the survey teams, the installation of specialized sensors months ago. I saw the Fed's Project Terminus realize that to exploit this power source, to develop a true, sustainable energy infrastructure without relying on old tech, they had to eliminate the keepers, the only beings who knew how to balance and regulate the power without destroying the planet. Project Terminus was not about safety or eradication. It was about resource theft, disguised as pest control. The 3 high-frequency tones I heard were their last desperate attempt to activate a deep Earth defense mechanism, which failed because the enemy had neutralized their primary conduit. The creature's eyes, magnified in my mind, held the image of the final assault. Not bombs, but massive, focused sonic weapons designed to rupture the colony's internal physical structure, incapacitating them before the chemical cleanup crews arrived. I saw the young ones, the elders, the entire fabric of their silent civilization dissolving in agony. The pain she was feeling now, the shock, the physical tearing of her body, merged with my own unbearable guilt. She pulled her hand back, the energy drain leaving me weak and reeling, vomiting onto the scorched earth. The keeper did not look angry. She looked utterly exhausted. Her amber eyes held a final message, crystal clear in my shattered mind. You know now. The knowledge is a wound. Carry it. She turned her massive body slowly, impossibly, and took 2 stumbling steps into the thickest part of the ancient cedar grove. With a sound that was half sigh, half groan, she sank down, disappearing into the shadows of the old trees, presumably to die alone, hidden from the human world that had judged and executed her. I crawled out of that valley 2 hours later, leaving the obsidian behind. I was fundamentally changed, a broken vessel now holding forbidden knowledge. I no longer feared the creature, I feared humanity. The consequences were immediate and absolute. Within 48 hours, I was detained by unmarked federal agents. They didn't torture me. They used sophisticated psychological techniques, questioning me about seismic anomalies and my paranoid delusions regarding missing forest workers. They knew exactly what I saw, but they operated on the principle of plausible deniability. They took my camera, my notes, and my truck. They wiped my records clean. I was fired from the Forest Service for mental instability and unauthorized access to restricted areas. The sheriff personally delivered a thinly veiled threat. Talk about the creatures, the colony, or terminus, and I wouldn't just lose my freedom. I would disappear into the ecological reports they had manufactured. I became a phantom. I isolated myself completely, moving to this remote cabin in another state, drinking heavily for the first few years just to drown out the constant screams of the sonic assault I had witnessed through her eyes. Every sound became a potential threat. My life was destroyed not by the Sasquatch, but by the weight of their stolen truth. The guilt of survival was a constant acid in my soul. I was given the knowledge, but I was powerless to share it effectively. I had failed the Guardians. I am 78 now, my voice trembling, my hands shaking as I record this. The Feds succeeded. The Cascade colony is gone. Sector Prime has been sealed off under the perpetual guise of geological instability testing. They are mining the resource the colony protected, exploiting the very core of the planet, entirely undisturbed by the ethical complexity of having wiped out an ancient peaceful people. The irony of the name Project Terminus is the final bitter pill. It means the end point, the boundary. For the feds, it meant the end of the mystery, the boundary that they successfully crossed and eliminated. But for me, the word means the final desolate boundary of human morality. We encountered something ancient, something intelligent, something capable of coexistence. And our answer was overwhelming destruction for the sake of resources. I never told anyone the full truth of the memory transfer until now. It wasn't just physical contact, it was a desperate final transfer of an essential truth. They knew they couldn't survive us, but they ensured that their knowledge and their sorrow did. Some things in those woods were never meant for us,